Welcome to the IUPUI Center for Translating Research into Practice monthly conversation with our Scholar of the Month. My name is Steve Vieweg. I'm the Associate Director of the Center, and it's a pleasure to welcome you here for our monthly opportunity to talk with one of our esteemed scholars. Today, we're delighted to share with you a conversation with Dr. Gerardo Maupome. But before we get started, we have several things we'd like to share. First, we'd like to remind you that the idea of the Center for Translating for Research into Practice is the brainchild of Professor Emeritus Sandra Petronio, who is a translational scholar herself, now in retirement, and she was married at the time, still is married, to our Chancellor Emeritus Charles Bands. And the two of them had the vision that there should be a center on our campus that would identify, highlight, and promote research that is translational. So we're indebted to their thoughts and ideas about making this happen. They created a couple of awards for this and have promoted this kind of work on our campus. And we are glad to continue to do this, including with these monthly conversations. We're all used to Zoom, but just a reminder, please stay muted during this time, but later we'll ask you to unmute, turn on your cameras when we have a conversation. But you're welcome to use the chat to put down ideas, questions that you have. We will be recording this session today. If you want to see it later or have a friend or colleague that you'd like to see this. And reminder, you will receive one of those post-evaluation emails from us, an opportunity to give some feedback about the presentation today, the discussion, as well as other ideas for future events that the center could promote. You want to keep in touch with us and learn more things. You can get continuing education for this series. If you're interested, you can visit expandiu.edu and look for the Center for Translating Research into Practice. We hope that you'll not only check us out on our website at trip.iupui.edu, but follow us on social media. That's how you can keep up to date on the great things that are happening here on campus. Pick your choice of the things that you like. This work is not possible without support. The Vance Community Fellow Award, there's a research fund that helps support that work. So if you or a colleague might be interested, please consider adding this to your list of philanthropic opportunities so we can continue this great work. We are really appreciative of our partnership with the library here on campus and their work in promoting what they call scholar work. So if you go to our website, example today, you could go to the page and click on Dr. Maupome. You could see more about his work. And then you can see right there, after a description of the exciting work that he does, a list of the easily accessible journal publications that are available on ScholarWorks. So all you have to do is click on the link. You can also go down to the bottom to the ScholarWorks link and see the entire ScholarWorks collection at the library. This is Dr. Maupome's page, but you can see how easy it is to link to see his journal work. October is a busy month for us here. Next coming up in the Center for Translating Research into Practice, we hope that you'll join us on Friday, October 13th for something special called a Spotlight, where we're featuring our inaugural fellow, Dr. Susan Hyatt, and we're calling that Sue and the City, Adventures in Translational Research in Indianapolis. Learn more about her work. And then our Scholar of the Month will be Dr. Susana Mariscal, and that'll be on the October 27th, where we'll have our regular monthly conversation. We're also in October hosting our annual Trip Awards and Fall Showcase. So come and learn about this year's Fellow and Scholar awardees, as well as the Vance Petronio Trip awardee, Holly Cusack-McVeigh, who will be sharing some of her work on that Wednesday, October 11th, between 2:30 and 5 in the campus center. We'll also be showcasing some other IUPUI translational scholars. They'll be just pointing out some of their work so that you can learn more about what they do. It's a great opportunity to find out what's happening here at IUPUI. We're interested in knowing more about what you'd like us to do. So our research endeavors here in the center are going to ask you a few brief questions. So Nuri's going to lead you through, and we're going to ask you to go ahead and please answer some questions using the Zoom poll chat. So Nuri, bring it on. Thank you for taking a moment to give us some feedback as we get started today. Well, today, as I mentioned, we are super excited to have with us Dr. Gerardo Maupome, who is a professor at the Fairbanks School of Public Health and involved in the campus CTSI project in a variety of ways. As mentioned earlier, the Vance Petronio duo created the Vance Petronio Translating Research into Practice Award, and Dr. Maupome was the 2021 recipient. Today, he's going to talk to us, give us some thinking about the first wave of COVID and its influence on social media. And so we are very excited to have him here with us. And I'm going to invite him to turn on his camera. And I need to get back to, where did it go? Here we go. So he can turn on his camera and get us started. So over here, there you go. You're ready to go, Dr. Maupome, and welcome. We can't wait to hear what you have to share.
Thank you so much. Let me see if I can find the correct sharing screen process. It seems to be, yeah, I think I survived this one. Well, thank you very much. Can you see my slides? Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
All right. Well, first and foremost, I want to mention the magnificent role that Charles and Sandra had in keeping this adventure alive. I love the idea. I love the people here, and that certainly includes for sure Stefan and Nuri. It's been a real pleasure to work with all of them in different opportunities that I had. And today I'm going to talk about something that is perhaps a new spin on my long-standing interest in social networks of, in this case, of Hispanics. And what I'm going to do is to explain why we had this amazing opportunity to expand our knowledge about social networks and situations that were really exceptional and extreme, such as the COVID-19 pandemic. What I want to do, okay, let me see if I can have this working, okay. Yeah, so here they are. The most important thing, perhaps, is that under normal circumstances, there will be some challenges in getting underrepresented minority groups to participate in research. But that became even more challenging when we started looking at a situation whereby some community groups were affected more markedly than others during the COVID-19 epidemic. We're going to talk specifically about the 2020 impacts. And I want to make sure that we look at first at some personal community networks parallels. We're going to see how they have a role in health. Then we are going to have this notion of networks may be protective because they provide support or resources, but also damaging because they perpetuate unhealthy behaviors and practices. Then we're going to look specifically at a situation with the effect, the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, and then see how the networks may have been affected. And the idea here is that we want to look at the health issues, not from the point of view of the individuals. That is important, of course, and most of the research in health has largely been either on the individual or in large groups of people, in population health research, for example. But what we're doing with the social network perspective is to understand that there is a degree of interdependence between actors in one group. And we tend to use those social norms as a way to decide what is it that is acceptable, what is it that prompts us to have some sort of action implemented. But most importantly, we can measure quantitatively those interactions, the flow of information, and how different factors, the interactions, and the systems change over time. So we really have a great opportunity with social network analysis. Now, it also happens that we have a group, a very strong group in social network analysis research in Bloomington. And I have learned a lot from the likes of Bernice Pescosolido, Bria Perry, Anne McCraney, and Eric Wright, who's no longer in IU. but they really spent a good chunk of time trying to get me somewhat familiar with the concepts, and I fell in love with them because they're really very interesting on how these links across actors really help have better or worse oral health, more effective or less effective tools to address health problems. And the idea here is that not only the information flows in a way that provides information, but also there is a social regulation of health behaviors. For example, if I have a friend or a group of friends that think that Saturday is to drink a couple of bottles of tequila, well, my health outcomes are going to be different if I go to another place where moderate drinking is more likely to be the social norm. And that regulation of behavior helps us decide when health, care, or preventive efforts are necessary and how they seem to be affecting the person individually or the group. So what we really do here is understand that there is a volition element in how we see these social norms, how do we act. But there is always an overlay of social, commercial, industrial determinants of health where we live. And the idea here is in this diagram by Lisa Berkman, an excellent piece of work, already a couple of decades old, is that we have on the far left the socio-structural conditions that condition a lot of what we do. This would be a natural home for the social, industrial, commercial determinants of health. But when we start moving closer to the individual in the social networks column, this is where we have the social network structure, because we have the size, the density, how close they are, how reachable are those actors. And we can measure these characteristics of network ties. We can measure a number of things that will help us understand what the network is doing for the individual and what is doing for the network itself and other connections. So the idea here is that this type of analysis is extremely useful when you have to design preventive or clinical interventions, for example, because you know where to get in if you can identify the entry points in a network where you will have the right kind of response. For example, we have some of the Mexican community or the Central American community have a little use for seeking the first point of advice, the same point of deciding whether healthcare is needed from professionals. And that is simply because the social regulation is that there will be some Hispanic specific, a member of that community that will help them understand that, you know, this is serious enough to do something. Example is having a non-licensed nurse from El Salvador who happens to be here, and they don't provide care, but they do provide orientation. And when a person approaches them and says, you know, Doña Maria, what do you think about this kind of situation? My son has been having this problem for a long time, and I'm not really sure what to do. Well, you know something, you should really take him to the hospital or to the clinic because this looks like important, that is not resolving by itself. That kind of thing really is what places the intermediate level of factors in the perspective of what we want to do in medical sociology. We can address not only the network pieces, but also social support, social influence, social engagement, person-to-person contact, and access to material resources and goods. So we're going to concentrate our attention for the time being in the middle levels, the two columns of the middle levels, but we're going to have an opportunity to examine the individual impact later on. I'm going to borrow from this image that was created by my friend and colleague, Bria Perry. And the idea here is that the distribution of impacts in a catastrophic situation is not equal. And you can see this on the left-hand side, that there are not only racial, ethnic wealth gaps, but after the Great Recession, those differences became more marked. And you can see that here, you have over the years, the wealth in the white population remained pretty much constant or so on, but in the case of Blacks, it went down. And if you look at Hispanics, it's the same sort of thing. Now, looking at the right-hand side of the slide, we see that only upper income families have median wealth greater than prior to the Great Recession. So what we really have is that you have the upper income has actually increased their income or their wealth. Whereas if you look at middle income, that hasn't happened. You know, lower income is pretty evident that there hasn't really been an opportunity for them to become better prepared to address adversity. Another example that Bria put together for another talk is the Hurricane Katrina kind of situation. And this is actually fascinating. On the left-hand side, you have African Americans are more likely than whites to report financial and employment problems. And what we have is in the blue bars, the African Americans, the orange are the white group. And then you find that problems with credit card debt or other personal debt, there's almost double the impact for African Americans. Someone in household had overtime or regular hours cut back, again, same thing, fall behind in paying rent or mortgage. This is actually pretty clear that this kind of thing happens, and so on and so forth. We will have on the right-hand side the Katrina experiences compared by income. So we had those households that make less than $20,000 a year, and those that make 50 or more. And again, on similar or different elements of precarity or having a problem during the Katrina event is that you're more likely as a poorer person to be concerned about elderly family members living in the path of the hurricane, fear for your life. It's almost twice as likely for those that were poor compared to those that were better off. Separated for at least a day from family members, went without food for at least a day, which is pretty clear that there is a differential impact, without drinking water for at least a day, spent at least one night in an emergency shelter. And the idea here is that the more we become familiar with the general elements of living conditions of different groups, we can have a better sense of what kind of impact we can anticipate and perhaps design interventions to try and address those things. So Bernice Pesco-Solido came up with this idea, it's probably 3 or 4 years old, to conducting a person-to-person health interview survey. And what she did together with a large group was to collect information about those factors that shape health in Indiana. And they use a stratified probability sample of households across the state. Usually this is a bit problematic because Hispanic households tend to have a 30% underrepresentation because some of these households do not figure in driver's license rosters, for example, or in tax return rosters, or some of the things that are clearly identifiable. So we cannot say that we identify all the Hispanics in the state because there is a good chunk of them who happens to be underground. Now, person-to-person, P2P, the excellent data collection, the study continues to a very large extent, and then COVID happened. And then, besides collecting all of this information, what Bria did was to create a rapid response kind of study, went to the SAGE Foundation and said, I need money to do this kind of thing. They gave her the money, and around April, if I'm not mistaken, April and May, when people were already hunkered down in their houses, there was a phone interview to assess how those living conditions and social factors may have been affected by the pandemic. And with that, Bria and Bernice created a pandemic precarity index, which essentially summarized the food, housing, and financial insecurity indicators, very much along the lines of the images I shared for Katrina and for other catastrophic situations. What they found, and this is published in the proceedings of the National Academy of Science, is that there is a clear gradation between the precarity situation in terms of housing insecurity, food insecurity, financial insecurity, and being fired or unemployed, from those that are traditionally better off compared with those that are traditionally less well off. And we can see that this happens not only across racial disparities, but also along educational disparities. We have obvious impacts in the groups that are less likely to be in a position to address this kind of challenge. Now, again, I make the point that the Hispanics here are those including the official sampling frameworks. Now, what Bria and I did is to address this kind of situation by looking at those Hispanics living in Indiana who are the more likely candidates for not being part of a statewide sampling framework. So what we did, it was to look at the resources that I have been doing, the VidaSana study funded by NIH. And what we're doing here is following a cohort of Hispanic immigrants to track health, social, and economic well-being for those people who have been in Indiana 6 months or less, and those that are established, who are parts of the network of those new immigrants. We collected the face-to-face information, certainly for the baseline, and I will explain this later. And we follow that at 6, 12, and 18 months. The idea was to see how the networks of those persons that are newly arrived will evolve over time, and with that, the ability to meet the challenges in a better or worse situation for those recent immigrants. So the idea here is how much of the networks and the recreation of the networks is helping you to have resources that will address oral health, but oral, mental, general well-being health. Now, exactly in the same fashion that Bria created this rapid response study from the P2P, Bria and I came up with this Hispanic rapid response study that took us back to the VidaSana cohort, and we elicited information in August of November in 2020. And we were asking very much the same sort of questions that the COVID study for the general population did, but we had put that in the context of the Hispanic experiences. So what we have here is that some of these data sets from either 2, 3, or 4 studies were put together. In this case, what we have is a comparison of the immigrant experience in Indiana. This is not about income, this is not about education. Let's talk about the recency of immigrant. And you find that the probability of losing a job was about the same between immigrant groups compared with the non-immigrant. The probability of being laid off and hours reduced, again, it was more marked in the immigrant, recent or not, than compared with the non-immigrant. But some of these features actually turn out to be somewhat worrisome, because you see that the probability of COVID affecting food security was far more marked in the new immigrant situation, and the same for housing security. This actually replicates in hard numbers what we saw during that year and the following year, that there was definitely hunger in the Hispanic community in the deprived areas of central Indianapolis. That I know for a fact, but I have references that the same anecdotal reports come from other parts of the state. Now, let's talk about the VidaSana study sequence. And one of the reasons why we did this data collection, not only address the issue of what was the impact, but because we were doing a survey that had 4 data collection points, the interesting thing is that we knew that there would be some sort of impact from COVID-19 when it came to this sort of situation. So as you can see, the first interview took place in August 2017 for the VidaSana study. And then that person started going through the first interview, second interview, third interview, and finished the 4th interview later. But while we collected all the data at baseline, face-to-face, we had already prepared to have data collection through a mix of phone interviews and internet-based answer options. And the reason for that is that the very recent immigrants tends to relocate very quickly, following probably the opportunity to work in areas that have more work available to them. So it is not uncommon that they relocate. They arrive in Indianapolis, but then they have a cousin in Philadelphia, says, oh, there's a lot of construction here, you should come over here. I mean, you stay at home. So that person goes away, but we still track where they went and how they were doing. The overall point here is that we needed to ascertain which factors affected variables over time, in particular those variables modifying the evolution of networks. VidaSana was about the evolution of networks, how things change over time. And immigration is a major reset point for networks, because you move to another country, it's like going to jail, getting out of jail, getting married, getting a divorce. So you lose part of those networks, and you recreate those networks, or you simply let go of them. In this case, it is an essential element of immigration when you move, because you still have connections with the old country, but there are a lot of things that you have to address in the day-to-day basis in order to make sure that you function within the social group of what is being done in your daily life. Now, we addressed all of the VidaSana variables in the cleaning to ascertain the impact of COVID in evolution networks. But in doing so, we created a number of papers that were carried out by the people doing a lot of the work in terms of data collection, or in terms of people doing the analysis from a social network perspective. I have to mention here this paper, Stress and Alcohol Intake Among Hispanic Adult Immigrants in the US Midwest. This is the first part of a contrast that we have made, because using the audit system to ascertain alcohol intake and alcohol use disorder, we were able to show that there were some people that were drinking a lot and a large proportion that abstained from drinking. This is for the established and the new immigrants. But stress, the levels of stress as measured in a separate variable, did not have an obvious impact on alcohol intake or alcohol use disorder. Interestingly enough, there was no difference between the new immigrants and the established immigrants. And usually recent immigrants tend to drink less. So lack of a difference here probably suggests that the recent immigrant actually increased the alcohol intake to be about the same as the established immigrants. This is Jackie Rodriguez and Cindy Rodriguez, who led this study. Now, there's another one that I'm doing with Caroline Brooks. It's not under review. It's going to be e-published probably next week. And what we did here is to take a look at some specific areas of dental health. We were asking, have you ever had a fluoride applied to your teeth? Have you ever had any dental fillings? How often do you use dental floss? And then we looked at a standard social support measurement. And what we found is that the higher social support made dental outcomes better for Mexicans, but had no effect or was detrimental for Central American. That is kind of counterintuitive. But what we find is that the country of origin and level of education were important factors in predicting less favorable outcomes for dental health. But the recency of immigration didn't really quite matter as much within the very recent time that people had immigrated. This is not surprising. Cecilia Menjivar has found that Central American immigrants had social networks that may be favorable or not favorable, depending on the balance of the relationship, that may be very close, but very negative. And in fact, the social relationships may not be not only a network of help and support, but also a source of burdens and constraints. And that reflects into the health impacts that we find. The migration difference between the Mexican and Central American participants in the study, and Denise Ambrose and the rest of the group on Bria Perry's gang, so to speak, we looked at the context of exit for those Latinx immigrants, and it actually corroborated what we found, because when you have higher pre-migration adversity, you had higher levels of stress, worries about COVID-19, and had more material insecurity during the pandemic after controlling for a whole bunch of variables. So we concluded that the early disadvantages in the migration trajectory can lead to additional risk as immigrants transition to the US, and therefore it offers some information for us to understand that the issue here is not simply thinking that, oh, all Hispanic, Latinos, all of them are the same. In actual fact, there is a lot of nuances depending on what was the origin, the time in the US, the kind of work that they do, and several of these variables really lend themselves to the kind of intervention entry points that we should be looking in the future. We also asked, this paper was led by Emily Eckel, who together with Caroline Brooks did a lot of the data analysis for many of these papers. And here we ask, how did they get the information that were specific to COVID-19 information and resources? Use safe distance, use gloves, wear a mask consistently, that kind of thing. And there were differences across gender, country of origin, and level of schooling. But the one thing that we confirmed, because we knew that from prior research, is that the first contact that these immigrants have in seeking advice is not with professionals. You see that the doctors here on the left-hand side, they're actually not all that well put in that ability for some of the immigrants. But there's a family and friends, internet, and so on and so forth play different roles. Now, using the same index of pandemic precarity that Bria and Bernice developed a few years ago, Melissa Garcia ran this study, and here we found that in terms of the gender social expectations, there were differential effects in terms of the family having children and in terms of the gender of the parent that we're talking about. Some of you know that, for example, this concept of self-sacrifice and femininity is what is called Marianism in many cultures, not only Hispanic culture, where the mother is the center of the family. They sacrifice everything for the kids. They're always super interested in that. And in actual fact, this is one of the reasons why many of the interventions, as long as we have a good reason to believe that is the case, should really address the mothers, because they actually make a lot more things happen than we imagine if you look at the family just for outside. The differential effects with that for men, any family time was an increase in precarity. If they were single, they were not too bad. They had a spouse, the precarity, the worry went up. And if they had children, it was even worse. In the case of women, only having children increased the precarity, while being married decreased the precarity for that woman, which is a very interesting thing to do, and again, important information on how to disseminate our work. This is the more networky of the analysis led by Nick Smith, and it's been published in Sociology of Race and Ethnicity. And what we find here is that immigrants, and any kind of person, but certainly in the case of immigrants, the beauty is that because they are fresh and they start developing these networks, it is easy to measure how they evolve and how they expand. So like any human being, we engage in deliberate and selective activation of networks. For example, I call my mom to ask for a cooking recipe. Yeah. Oh, she is my network go-to person. We have a very close relationship in terms of cooking. Another one is my sister, my younger sister. But there are certain things that I don't talk with my mom, which is probably my romantic life or my sexual life, for very simple reasons that we all understand. But that essentially means that all networks are functionally specific, and the immigrants are not different. The issue here is that because they are in a resource-constrained environment, they fall back on the community to get resources they want. And one thing that is well established is that ethnic enclaves may offer access to cultural resources and supportive community networks, but they may also reproduce segregations that are simply not conducive to better health. Classical example is Hispanic Latinos. They come to Indiana and they continue buying bottled water or water in large containers because they don't trust the tap water. Because in Mexico, certainly in Central America, if you drink from the tap, basically you're nuts. You're going to get sick. But by buying water, those minority groups are not getting the fluoride that is included in the community fluoridation that exists in Indiana. So they have already something against them in terms of dental health. So some of this is a lot more versatile than that, but this is a good example of how being in an enclave doesn't quite help you to make the most of the opportunities or resources that are available to you. So let me approach the end by saying that we have some take-home messages. The impacts of Hispanic health disease were multiple, were severe, and for the first year, they were the group that was more negatively affected, more than African Americans and American Indians. Then things changed as the pandemic progressed, and African Americans, American Indians actually took the dubious honor of being the groups that were most affected. Now, there are a lot of variations when it comes to Hispanic health, and it has to do with how well created is the network where that person comes from and where they arrive. There's a beautiful book by Bashi. It's called The Survival of the Knitted. And it goes to show, using Caribbean immigrants to London and to the US, that there are different characteristics, but it always revolves around what are the features of the network where they arrive. Now, as I said before, there are caveats to adopting a single monolithic lens to interpret Hispanic health as clan-oriented, positive, protection of the elderly, the importance of the kids. Yeah, those exist, but they are not perfect because some of these interactions are less positive, as you will expect. And I think, and it's not only something new, it's been a very important element of social network studies, is that if you're going to do something about those characteristics, you need to take into account what is the network doing for that person and doing for the community and doing for you when you design an intervention. And this distinction really flotates someplace between the social causes of health impacts, the context where people live, and the social factors that determine the distribution of such causes, which is essentially social class and socioeconomic status. So with this, I finish. I do appreciate your time. I am not terribly late. And I really have this long list of people that have honored me with their collaborations, and I have learned a lot from them. And I'm probably forgetting a couple of them. I do apologize for that. But I've been blessed with amazing project managers, students, and community collaborators, interviewers, and certainly co-investigators in doing this. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Maupome, for sharing a lot of information for us to think about. And as we like to do at this point in our conversations is to open up the floor and invite you, the audience, to turn on your camera and join the conversation and to propose questions for discussion or to dig deeper into any of the topics that were presented by Dr. Maupome. So are there any, does anybody have something they'd like to ask about or to get clarification on or to encourage some conversation?
Well,
as you're thinking, oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, one question I had was, thank you again, Dr. Maupome, for your presentation. It's very informative. One question I had is, I'm not sure if I missed it or not, but how did you initially identify the new immigrants for the study? And was it easy for you to develop trust with them, for them to open up and give you their contact information? And
those are actually key questions to doing this type of research, because we have enough of a presence with parishes and community organizations so that we go to the parish on the Spanish language mass on a Sunday morning and just ask, hey, how you doing? Hey, Dr. Maupome, glad to see you here. Hey, do you know any person that might have arrived from outside within the last 6 months? Oh, yeah, look at the Perez's over there. They have a cousin that just arrived, and that kind of thing. That established the first element. But the most important thing is the issue of trust. And I think that just because we have been working on this for 10, 15 years, there is a brand name that people in the Hispanic community is, oh yeah, this is Gerardo again. That's fine. I go to the priest and say, can you give me the opportunity to speak from the pulpit during the parish announcements? And things of the like that created the type of presence that will allow people to trust you, at least at a minimum level. And those newcomers, if they're coming from El Salvador and they're probably running for their life, they are really very scared of having this kind of interaction with the outside world. And let me remind you that we did this research. The entire collection of data was done during the Trump administration and a good chunk during the pandemic years. So I take a special pride in saying that we have an 81.7% retention rate at the end of the fourth follow-up, and that is not a small thing. We had trouble getting new people into the study, but once that they were in the study, they were retained very effectively. And since we have Cindy Rodriguez here in the audience, I want to draw attention to the fact that some project managers did support this effort, but Cindy was really at the forefront of this kind of component of the study. That was particularly difficult at the time that Hispanic immigration was demonized by the federal administration. Now, the interesting thing about all of this is that that great retention rate really had to do with our techniques to maintain contact with them, showing up in the parish, sending birth month cards, making sure that we knew as, hey, where is Jose Perez? I cannot find him. Oh, he actually moved to Kentucky. Okay. Can you ask him if it's okay to have his phone number? Oh, they have the same phone number. Okay, so we know where to find that person and how to arrange for the data collection taking place in some more convoluted situations. And in fact, we didn't have that many people being deported, but we conducted the final data collection with one person in Reynosa, in the Mexican border, another two in Guatemala or Honduras, I don't remember well. But that essentially meant that we were able to track them down to a very high level of sophistication. Any other questions?
Hello.
Yes, go
thank
ahead,
you for
Michael. Oh, go ahead. And you were starting to speak, Mr. Hutcherson, then we'll have Michael go after you.
All right. My apologies. Thank you for your presentation. I wanted to find out a little bit more about the precarity measure, precarity index, how you went about identifying the variables or just motivations for developing an index of that nature. And can you see something like that being used for other areas, for other populations as well? In particular, to thinking about policy, developing policy.
Yeah. Considering the time constraints we have now, I wouldn't get into the details of that. That research was led by Bria Perry, and she's a medical sociologist who took whatever kind of techniques to see which variables hung together and then create the index. My suggestion is you go to the Bria Perry et al. Proceedings of the National Academy of Science. That's a paper that came out in 21, if I'm not mistaken, and it describes the entire development of the index. And now you're completely right. This precarity index perhaps was even more significant because we had information about precarity, food, employment, housing, all that kind of thing. We had them from before the COVID-19 pandemic and during the COVID-19 pandemic. So it was actually easy to see how the changes could have been attributed to the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think you make an excellent point. I will point out to the paper by Bria because it really makes a great case for that index. Yeah.
Thank you.
Michael.
Go ahead, Michael.
Thank you very much, Gerardo. Thank you. Very interesting, as always. You educate me. Just curious, the immigrants, new or established, did you have information of where they came from in those countries? And what I'm thinking there is a rural versus an urban or capital city community. Somebody coming from San Salvador instead of La Libertad, or Guatemala City instead of Jutiapa. So, as you know, I spent a lot of time in that part of the world, and I know that there's a different exposure of those people necessarily to the option for healthcare while they are still at home, as it were, before they came here. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does, and I think you're completely right in appreciating how this works in terms of where people come from. In fact, we have variables for both established and recent immigrants where we ask them, do you come from a capital city, a large city, small city, village, and a small ranch? And that allows us to create an index of rurality. And there are several of those, so we're not going to create something new, but we have the information for both established and recent immigrants, that information. I have one of my students, Dylan Jones, we're looking at the rurality effect to see if some of these key outcomes were governed or affected by how rural was the community where the person came from. And it is an absolute distinction when it comes to Hispanic Latino immigration, because it really speaks to where in the acculturation trajectory that person inserts. For example, in my case, a college-educated, middle-class kid from Mexico City, parents reading primarily a lot of newspapers and magazines in English. By the time I came to the US, I was far more westernized and more in tune with social values that some of them were American, some of them were simply middle class. If you contrast what I do for health, compare with a person that comes from a rancheria, a small ranch in the middle of nowhere in Oaxaca, that person has probably had a couple of years of formal education. They have some of them have some sort of literacy, some others they just semi-functional literacy, and their ability to understand the American world and how to deal with nuances, for example, navigating the medical or dental care, just happened to be a different type of challenge. In fact, another spin-off of the VidaSana is we created a navigation manual for Central American immigrants to explain to them what was the deal with teeth around here. So what were the expectations of the dentist? What the kinds of rights and resources you had? Where to go where you needed cheap or free dental care? What are the basic elements that lead to tooth decay, to periodontal disease, and also some sort of a very empathic empowerment with a telenovela, a photonovela kind of description, inviting people to be part of that because Manuel sees Jose, and Jose didn't make it to work yesterday because had a terrible toothache, went to the dentist, and the dentist says $5,000. And then Manuel explains, well, this is what you have to do. You need to understand the difference between episodic dental care in other parts, but you have the right to solicit, to seek a resolution of problems that don't start with the $5,000 in right off the bat. So you're completely right. As soon as I have the study from Dylan and I will share it with the group because it is extremely interesting, and you're completely right. The rurality is a major issue here. Any other question? Comments?
I'm wondering about there were a couple things that really intrigued me about your presentation. One about the rurality question, because there's a lot of similarities perhaps to our own state of Indiana, where we're largely a rural state. And so it makes me wonder about the application of what you're learning in this area and how it applies to Indiana. And in your discussion about social networks and how important that is, again, and how that might apply to, in general, in our state around health outcomes. So what do you think about that?
I think that there is a difference between the different types of residence location. I don't think it is necessarily a major education chasm, as it happens in the Hispanic population, and even more in those countries that have a more limited type of educational offerings, say, for example, Central America. In Indiana, you probably have access to some education. So formal schooling will take you to high school. And there are things that you will learn there. What really matters in terms of the rurality when it comes to Indiana is having a closely placed access to care point. Because if you live in a place that you have to drive a couple of hours to get to the next dentist, or even worse, in New Mexico or Arizona, that literally, for you to get from here to there to see the dentist is 2-hour drive. So, and then you have to return because they have to do something else like 4 or 5 days later. So the issue of accessibility is confounded by rurality. I wouldn't know how to use this at this specific time, but I am pretty sure that Bria has information about the rurality from the P2P study.
Wow. Great. I do want to call people's attention to the chat in Zoom, because there's a whole bunch of resources that Dr. Maupome has provided. If you want to dig deeper into the variety of sources that he was sharing. So there's links right there. And those will also be shared out later. If you don't have time and you don't want to be able to connect those, we will send those out in a follow-up email to you so that you'll have that at your fingertips, along with that link asking you to take a moment and give us some feedback about the session today and your ideas about other events. So I want to take a pause here at about 10 minutes of the hour to thank Dr. Maupome for his time today and getting us to think about this in a deeper way. And for those that need to carry on because you have appointments at the top of the hour, we understand that you may need to leave. And so we want to give a big round of applause and appreciation for the great work of Dr. Maupome on our campus in understanding more about translational research in the ways that he's presented. And those who would like to just stay on for a little bit longer will hang out for the opportunity to just continue some conversation. For those that need to, quick reminder, we have several events coming up in the next month. Please check us out